Hello Free Code Campers, my name is Jennifer Bland. I have created for you a series of videos that will help you get your very first job as a developer. These videos cover a process that's called the whiteboard exercise. This is an exercise that you will experience when interviewing for a job as a developer. It's where a company will evaluate your skill sets and your abilities to determine whether or not to hire you for that open position. I've shown you exact questions that I have been asked in the past when interviewing for jobs so that you can learn from what I have been, my experiences, and be able to use that to your benefit when you interview for your very first job as a developer. I have a series of videos that I've created for you. These videos cover topics such as HTML, they cover CSS. I have several videos on JavaScript and also videos on jQuery. These will help you as you start to interview for your very first job as a developer. If you have any questions or if you need to reach out to me, my website is www.jenniferbland.com. Hopefully these movies will be beneficial to you and will help you get your very first job as a developer. Thank you very much for watching. Write a function that takes a string as a parameter and returns the frequency of each letter of the alphabet that's found in that string. Okay, that might be a question that you might be asked in a whiteboarding exercising. Always when you're doing a whiteboard exercising, ask questions to the potential employer so that you understand exactly what they're expecting from you and what you actually want to bring to the table in terms of the functionality of your functions that you're going to create. So one of the first questions that I might ask is, okay, if you're given a string, what about case? Is case important? Is an uppercase A counted as 1 and a lowercase a counted as 1 for the lowercase? Or is that counted as 2 for A since they're both A's and it doesn't matter if it's uppercase or lowercase? So that would be one of the first questions that I would ask. So I'm just going to show you how to handle this, whether they ask you to treat uppercase or lowercase either the same or as separate letters. So let's get started and let's start working on our function that we're going to be creating for this potential employer. So we're going to start off, we're going to create a function, and I'm just going to call my function count. And my function, very simple, is called count, and it's going to have the string as the input that they are giving me. And what I want to do is to go through and look through every character that's in the string and count the number of times that that letter appears in the string, and it returns that information out of the function. So the first thing that I want to do is, well, what about case? Is case important to you at all? And you need to find out if it is or not. So let's say that case isn't important. An uppercase A and a lowercase a are treated exactly the same. So what we can do is, the first thing that we can do is we can take our string and we're going to convert our string to lowercase. So that makes everything in the string all lowercase. So anything that was previously uppercase will now be lowercase. And therefore we can actually be able to count what was previously an uppercase A as and a lowercase a as exactly the same, since they're now all the same case. So that's the first thing that I want to do. Now I need some type of container to hold the count of each individual characters. So one of the things that you can use is you can use a number, you can use an array if you want, or you can use an object. In this case, I'm going to actually solve this by using an object. So I need to define my object that I'm going to use. So I'm just going to create an object. So I have an empty object right here, and that's going to have my count that's going to be returned back out of this function. So the next thing that I need to do is loop through every single character that's found in that string. So I will need a for loop. All right, so now I have a for loop. This will go through every single character that's found in that string. And what I'm going to do is actually put that into my object. Now, what I can do is, in order to do a count, I'm going to take advantage of the functionality that's built into an object in JavaScript. An object is basically a key-value pair. What I'm going to use as a key is the letter. The value is the count of how many times that letter has appeared within that string. So that's what I'm going to be using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first check to see if that character is in my object that I'm going to be using as my placeholder. So if I'm going to check So what this will do, this will either return the actual character if it's in the object right now, and if not, this will actually return as undefined because it doesn't exist in the object itself. So what I want to do is, if it doesn't exist, then what I want to do is go through and add it to the object. If it does exist, in this case, this is asking, does it exist? And if it does exist, then I want to increase that value in that key value pair by 1 because it now has one more character found in that string. So in order to do that, what I can do is I come in, and I basically take the current character, which is found in this key, and I'm going to set its value to its current value plus 1. So therefore, I'm going to basically increase it by 1. All right. Then I'm going to have an else in here, and this is if the character doesn't currently exist in my object placeholder. So I'm going to now add it in there, and I'm going to set its value to 1 because it's the first time that this character exists. So what I have is I can put object All right, so now what I've done is I've gone in and I've added that letter to my placeholder object, and I've set its value equal to 1. And it will go through and it will loop through everything that's in there. Now, the last requirement that the potential employer asked me when they asked me to write this function was to actually go through and return the count of each letter that's found within the string. So the last thing that I want to do in my function is I actually want to return my object. And therefore, I've gone through and I've given them everything that they've asked me to do. So when you're going through, this is something that you might have asked as part of a coding challenge, and this is how you would actually go through and resolve that coding challenge. Now, when you start looking at this, there are a couple of things that you can actually do to this to make it a little bit better, make it run a little bit cleaner and so forth that comes in there. So one of the other things that you might ask is, well, what if the string has spaces in it? What if it has a period at the end of a sentence? What if it has a question mark or an exclamation mark or numbers that are in there? What do I want to do in that case? And you need to ask that question. And it's something that you should ask because it tells the potential employer that you're thinking about scenarios that you might encounter in real-world applications. And that shows them that you have that ability to think about what might happen so that you can account for it within your code. So if they come back and they ask you, I only want to worry about letters, only the letters A through Z, I don't care about numbers, I don't care about punctuation marks, I don't care about anything else like that. So what we need to do is take our string that we've converted to uppercase, and now what we need to do is we actually need to strip out anything that's not a character. And so we can actually go in and change this. So I'm going to add a line in here, and I'm going to use a regex expression, and a regex expression will basically go through and says, here's my criteria, anything that doesn't match it, I'm going to basically strip it out of the string. So in my match, what I'm going to be looking for is for anything that's not A through Z or A through Z uppercase. And if it's in there, I'm going to replace it with quote quotes, which basically means it's going to strip it out. So if you had a string that was, hello Apple, how are you today? And there was an exclamation mark at the end of hello Apple and a how are you today? There was a question mark at the end, and then maybe 1, 2, 3 after the question mark. This would basically pull out, this would go through and pull out all of the spaces, the exclamation marks, the periods, anything that's not a letter. And a letter is anything A through Z, so it's going to remove that. So that's one of the first things that I can do as an improvement to the first iteration that I did on my function. Another thing that I can do is, if I look at this if-else that's in here, you're starting to see some repetition that you have in here, that it's basically taking this, it's setting this key, and it's either adding a 1 to the current value or setting the value to equal to 1. Well, you can actually take that and combine that into a single statement using a ternary operation. So if we come in, I'm going to actually erase this if statement. And what we're going to do is we can replace that, and what we're replacing is object So this is what I'm setting, and I'm going to either set it equal to 1, or I'm going to take its current value and increase it by 1. So I'm going to set it equal to here, and I'm going to do a ternary operation where I'm going to check to see if it's currently there, and if it is there, if it is true, then I'm going to increment So what the ternary operation is going to do is I'm setting this value, and what I'm doing is I'm doing a comparison. I'm going to check to see if the current letter is in my placeholder object. If it is, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take its current value, and I'm doing a plus plus on it, which means I'm going to increment it by 1. Then if it's not there, then you have the false statement, and it's going to be setting it equal to 1 so that we actually see that. And this information, that whole for loop, all that if-else that was in here can be replaced with this one line so that we have it in here. And then this information gets returned back to you. So that is a way of actually going through and implementing a whiteboarding exercise for doing things. Some of the things that you might also see this implementation of this function in some other variations. And some of the other most common variations that you might find on that is, instead of returning the frequency of every character that's found in the string, they might ask you to return the character that has the most frequent iteration in the string itself. So what you would do is, once you've got everything into your object, in here before you do the return, what you're going to have to do is to basically look through that object and then check to see how many times each character occurs, and you find the one character that has the most occurrences, and then you actually return just the character and the amount of times that it actually occurs in there. So that's one thing that you would see as a variation to basically this simple question that you're using in an object. Another way of asking this variation of this function is it comes back and they might say, I'm going to give you a code snippet. You tell me if it is correct or not. And what they're meaning is they're going to give you something in the string that comes in is going to be like programming code, kind of like this function. And what they want to do is to check to make sure that you have an equal number of, like, if you have an open parentheses, you have a closing parentheses. If you have a open curly brace, you have a closed curly brace. Open parentheses, close parentheses, open square bracket, close square bracket, and make sure that they all line up evenly on there. And the way that they should line up, in here I have two sets of brackets. This one is open, this one's open, this is closed, and then this closes the first one that's in there. So you should always have, they should always pair up along that line. So that's one of the things you can compare. And the way that you can go in and modify this in your object is you would actually put in, if it has braces, so you might have, one of your keys might be braces, and in there you put in all of the open braces that you have, curly braces. And when you find a closed curly braces, you should remove the open one from the object itself, so that when I come in here, I'm like, okay, I have a open curly brace, open parentheses, so I'll put that into my object. Then I'll keep reading through my string, and then when I get the closed curly brace, I will go to my object, and if there's an open curly brace in there, I will remove it from the object. And then I'll go along, same thing here. I'll put an open curly brace in, open parentheses in, then I'll immediately take it out because I've reached the close. And if we were following along in our object would have, it would have an open parentheses, then it would have nothing in it because now that open parentheses has been removed. It would have an open curly brace, and that would be the only thing currently in the object. Then we come around to this line. Now our object will have two things in it. It would have this open curly brace, this open parentheses. When it sees this, it's going to remove this open parentheses from the object, leaving nothing but this open curly brace. And as you work your way through, when you get to the very end of your code, you should, at the end of the string, should have an object that has nothing in it. If there's nothing in the object, that means that the code snippet is valid. So that's one of the things that you can do as a variation for answering this question. So hopefully this information will help you out. The goal is to help you prepare for your whiteboarding interview that you're going to have for your software engineering positions. And this is how you would actually go about and answer these questions when you're presented with that information. Previously, I have gone through and just did the exercises directly on the board. Instead, I'm going to convert over to my computer, and I'm actually going to walk through a series of questions that you might have as part of a whiteboard exercise on HTML and CSS. Here are a series of potential questions that you might be asked as part of your whiteboarding exercise on HTML and CSS. Let's go through each of the questions. The first question is to write a CSS selector to select only the inner two list items in the markup below. We have list items for 1, 2, 3A, 3B, and 4. And what they're asking is for us to get a CSS selector that would only access 3A and 3B. There are multiple ways that you can go about doing this. So let's go through different ways that you can access just 3A and 3B. The first one is to start from the class that we have at the top. Then we go down to the unordered list and then to the list item itself. And that would give us 3A and 3B. We can skip the class and just go from the unordered list to the list item to the unordered list and then to the list item itself. And that would give us access to it also. And then another way of getting access to it would be to go to the list item, unordered list, and then list item. And that tells us to go directly to the children of the unordered list. And that would give us 3 different ways that we can get access to the inner two list items, 3A and 3B. It's possible that you will be asked a follow-up question on that, and that question in number 2 is to write a CSS selector to select only the first list item of the 2 list items in the markup above. So what we want to do is to get access to just 3A and not 3B that we were doing previously. So we can go through and we can start out with going to the unordered list, the list item, the unordered list, the list item, which would have given us both. And what we want to do is select the first child, which would give us 3A. And that's the difference between the first question and the second question. All right. The third question is, what is the difference between an ID and a class? An ID has to be unique. It can be assigned to only one DOM element at a time. A class can be assigned to multiple elements on the DOM page. In terms of specificity, an ID will have a higher value than a class because it has to be unique. An element can be assigned both an ID and a class, and an element can also be assigned more than one class. That is, in general terms, the difference between an ID and a class. The next question is it possible to change the location of an element on a page via CSS? And the answer is yes. We actually have 2 methods available to us, and that is position and float. That would give us the ability to look at things on the page. The one thing that you want to do is explain what is the difference between position and float if you're going to use them. Both of them take the element out of the page flow. Position requires a parent element to have a position set to relative or absolute in order for it to work. A float requires a parent element to have a clear fix applied, overflow hidden applied, or to be floated itself in order for it to work. Question number 5. What does the box model refer to in CSS? And the answer is it refers to how elements' size, including its borders, margins, and padding, is calculated. Question number 6. Is there a way to change the box model? And the answer is yes, because the default for the box model is content box. What content box does is it adds the borders, margins, and padding to the set width and height of the element to determine its size. If you use box sizing border box, then for an element, its size will take the size, the height and width that it's been assigned, and the borders, margins, and paddings will be subtracted from that so that the element will fit directly into the height and width that's been specified for that particular item. Number 7, what is the difference between these three selectors? And we have 3 different CSS selectors. The first one, div, refers to an element that has the name of div, and it's assigning its background color to be red. The second one is .div. This refers to an element that's been assigned a class called div, and it sets its background to blue. The last one, $div, refers to an ID, and it's setting the background on that element to green. Number 8, given this CSS, what would this HTML look like when it's rendered? And the CSS that we're given is div span has a color of red, and div greater than span has a background of green. And what they're asking is, do you understand what this background greater than span does compared to just doing div span? The first one, div span, what it does is it refers to any span within a div. So here we have a span, all work and no play, that's contained within a div. So this div span would be color red. So this text, all work and no play, would have red text. Also, we have down here a span that's directly inside a div, makes Jack a dull boy, and that would make its color red. So this first this first CSS would make all of the text in this HTML to be color red. Now, we have another CSS that is div greater than span, and we set its background to green. And what this does is refer to a span that is a direct child of a div. In here, we have a div, a paragraph, and a span. The span isn't a direct child of the div, it's a direct child of the paragraph. So this would not apply. The bottom one, the span, is a direct child of the div, so this background green would apply, and so makes Jack a dull boy would be red text, and it would have a green background. I want you to write a function that will take a string as an input, and it will return whether or not that string is a palindrome. And if you're not familiar with what a palindrome is a word that's written the same way both forward as it is backwards. Radar, pop, because when you think R-A-D-A-R, R-A-D-A-R, it's written the same way both forwards and backwards. The word hello, on the other hand, is not a palindrome. So what you want to do is write a function that determines if a string is a palindrome. Once you've been given the exercise by the potential employer, always ask questions. That allows you to show that you're questioning what is that you want to accomplish, how you're going to be able to accomplish it, and it provides feedback to the potential employers. So if I was given that question, one of the first questions I would ask would be, what type of return do you want to come out of this function? If it's a palindrome, do you want me just to give you the string back, or give you an empty string if it's not a palindrome, or do you want me to return a Boolean that would be true or false based on whether or not the word that I've been given is a palindrome? So that would be one of the first questions that I would ask, and most likely the answer they would be given is that they want the function to return true or false as to whether or not the string is a palindrome. So now that I've got some basic information, I can start working on my function. So what I do is I'll come over here and I'm just going to say I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call my function palindrome, and it's going to take in one parameter, which is a string. So now what I have is the beginning of what I'm going to show the potential employer in terms of my coding skills for solving this function. Now there are multiple ways that you can go about solving this function, and one of the most common ways that I see people try to solve it is they will take a for loop and they will loop through each character in the string, and they will compare that first character to the last character in the string, and if they're the same, they continue on. Then they compare the next character from the front and from the back, and they will see, are they the same? And then they will keep doing it until they meet at the middle, and if they meet at that point and every character matches, then you know that you have a palindrome. That's one way of doing it, but I think one of the things that they're really wanting to accomplish in that asking you that interview question is, how well do you know the native data types in JavaScript? Well, a string is a data type, one of the native data types that are in JavaScript. Another data type that you have is an object. A string, the native data type on string, does not have a method to do a reverse of the string. But an array, which is a type of an object in JavaScript, does have a built-in method called reverse that you can use to reverse things. Well, you're thinking, well, I'm asked to reverse a string, not an array. But one of the things that you can do is show that you have knowledge of all the primitive data types within JavaScript, and also how you can move between them to be able to accomplish what you want in this function. So if you want to use that built-in reverse and not have to rewrite everything by doing a for loop, I can use what's given to me natively within JavaScript on an array and use that reverse function. So now I need to figure out how I can get my string and convert it into an array. Well, the string method natively has a method on it that's called split. And split will actually convert a string into an array. So this is the first step that I'm going to do in my function. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a new variable. I'm just going to call it string2, and I'm going to set it equal to string.split. And the split method actually requires you to put in a parameter into the method that tells it on what it is going to be splitting the actual string itself. So I'm using quote, quote, which basically means after every single letter in the string, it's going to split it out into an individual element into the array. Now that I have it out into an array, what I can do is basically now I can reverse it. So I can do string2.reverse. So now I have my string is now reversed, so it is reversed. So now I've got to figure out what do I need to do to convert it from an array back into a string. And this, there is a method that's called join that will actually convert it back into a string. So I'm going to use the split method. I'm going to use the same quote, quote that basically says I'm just going to convert it all into a single string with nothing to separate them out. And I now have my string as a reverse. So string 2 now is an exact reverse of string. So what I want to do is then compare these and return them. So one of the things that I can do is I can just check to see if string is equal to string 2, and if it is, I can return true, else I'm going to return false. And there I have my function that I have written that will actually go out and compare to see if something is a true palindrome or not. Now, there's some things that I can do to actually make this a little bit better. One of the things I can do is I can take my if statement and take all of this code that's down here, and I can refactor that, and I can refactor it to where it just returns whether or not string is equal to string 2. So this one line is equivalent to what I had in my if statement before. So I make things a little bit easier because this is going to be either a true or false, and that's what I'm going to be returning out of my function. Now, there's also this thing that I can do, because in JavaScript you can actually chain methods together. So I can actually take all of these 3 lines and convert them into a single line. So I'm going to change this. So I have my var, and I'm going to have var string 2 is equal to string dot split dot, now it's an array, so now I'm going to reverse, and now I'm going to join it back together. So now I have string 2 in one line where I've converted it to an array. I've used the built-in reverse function that's built into an array to reverse it, and then I've converted back to a string. So now string 2 is an exact reverse, and I now can compare it between the two of them to see what's going on. So what I can do is, as I'm going through and I'm actually working on my function, I can actually write it and then completely refactor it, and while I'm refactoring it, actually explain it to the potential employer so they can follow my thought process. So I can tell them why I put this into one line, because it's easier, because I know everything that I want to do on that string is on one line. It's easy to follow. It's easy to understand. I do a single line of return on it to compare it. Now, another question I might need to ask the potential employer, because technically my function as it is written will work. There's some problems that this might have on here that you need to ask as part of your interview in your whiteboarding exam. And one of the questions that you might need to ask would be, well, do I need to worry about upper and lower case? You know, because radar with a capital R is the first letter, and then ADAR technically isn't a palindrome if you worry about case, because a capital R and a lowercase r are not equivalent. So in that case, this would fail. This would not return as a palindrome because of that case differential that you have in there. So you have to ask about that. Well, what about these outliers? What about these exceptions that I need to worry about? And they're like, oh, well, I don't worry about case. So uppercase R, lowercase ADAR would return true as a palindrome, just would the lowercase RADAR would return true. Well, if that is the case, then I need to convert my original string to lowercase or to uppercase, it doesn't matter, so that it's consistent. So what I can do in here, and I'm just going to convert it to lowercase. And so in here I've converted it to lowercase. So now that outlier of, well, what about case? Does that matter? So that would be a question that you might need to ask on there. Another thing would be, well, what do I do if what I'm passed in is an empty string? Do I need to return true or false for an empty string? So you need to ask for that. So if you've asked that question, so you would need to put in a line up here in the very beginning that would check to test to see if your string is a string or not. And that would be another test that you would have, would be, what if somebody put into passed into the function the number 1, 2, 3? Well, that's not a string, so you're not comparing that. So that would be another thing that you would basically ask the potential employer, well, what do I need to do if this string isn't a string? So somebody passed me in a number or a Boolean or a function or something else. How do I account for that? So that you need to be able to ask these questions, because just writing a simple 2-line function, yes, it does work. Will it work 100% of the time? No. Is what the employer paying you to do is to write code that will work 100% of the time? Yes. Are you meeting that criteria by just putting in 2 lines? And the answer is really no. So what I've done is I've put in the thing where I convert it to lowercase to handle whether or not upper and lowercase counts. Another thing would be, what if there's pronunciation that's in there, like a space? Do we account for space, or do we need to remove a space that's in there? So that would be another question that you have in there. If they tell you to remove all punctuation, like a space, a comma, a period, an exclamation mark, a question mark, before running your test, you can do that up here, just like you converted it to lower string. You can remove all pronunciation by using a regex expression that takes all pronunciation marks and removes them from the string. And then you can reverse it and compare it. So that would be something else that you need to ask the potential employer, before you actually, finish up your test that you have on there. So that just gives you some examples of things that are going on here, because basically in asking this very simple question, write a function that determines if a string is a palindrome, what the employer, like I said earlier, is basically wanting to see is, how well do you know JavaScript? How well do you know the native data types that are in JavaScript and the methods that are provided with them? We know that there's a reverse that's on an array. It's not there on a string. So is there a way that I can use that even though I'm originally starting with a string? And yes, you can, by knowing that you can split a string into an array, convert it back to a string, and then you can compare them that's in there. And as you're going through and you're writing it, make sure that you communicate your work as you're going along, so that they can understand that. And I think it's important to ask questions, especially about the outliers, about does case count? What if they don't pass me in a string? What do I do in that case? What if the parameter they pass into me isn't a string? What if it's some other data type, like a number? How do you want me to handle something along that lines? Do I need to remove pronunciation marks? So start asking questions like that, because these are real things that you're going to get in a day-to-day environment as a programmer. And what you're showing to that potential employer is that when you are faced with those on your day job, you're able to handle them successfully. And that's what they want in a potential employee. I'm going to convert over to my computer, and I'm going to give you a series of questions that you might be asked as part of a whiteboard exercising covering the topic of jQuery. So watch below and I will show you these questions. Here are a half dozen questions that you might be asked on jQuery as part of your whiteboard exercising when interviewing for a developer position. So let's go through each of these questions. Question number 1. What is the difference between $document.ready and window.onload? Well, the main difference is that document.ready is the earliest possible time that you can actually use JavaScript or jQuery to change the DOM in your browser. The window.onload event actually loads after document.ready. Document.ready loads as soon as the HTML is loaded, but not when all of the content has been loaded on the page. Window.onload occurs later, and it mainly occurs when things like the images that have already been loaded on the page itself. With window.onload, you're limited to only being able to attach one listener to it. But you can attach as many as you want to the $document.ready method. So that is the difference between document.ready and window.onload. Number 2, can you delay the execution of $document.ready? And the answer is yes, you can. The jQuery.holdReady, where you pass in the hold to the method, will hold or release execution of jQuery's ready event. In order to make this work, this method must be called very early in the document. So what I recommend doing is that you put it in the head of your HTML, and you should put it as the very first line after your script tag, which loads jQuery. If you happen to call this method after the ready event has already fired, then it will have no effect. That's why you want to load it early on, so that you can actually pause the execution of the $document.ready. Number 3, what is the difference between jQuery's detach, hide, and remove functions? Well, let's take them one at a time. The hide function sets the element's CSS display property to none. So it's still there, but you just can't see it. The remove function actually removes it from the DOM, so it's no longer there at all. Detach is kind of like remove. It removes it from the DOM, but it keeps all the stored data and events associated with the matched elements. You can actually reinsert an item that was detached into the DOM. And the way that you do that is that when you detach an element, you actually assign it to a variable. Then when you want to reattach it, then you can take that variable and then just like append it back into the body or someplace else so that it's now available. And that's the difference between the detach, hide, and remove functions. So question number 4. What is the difference between jQuery's AJAX, GET, and POST functions or methods? And the main difference is the jQuery AJAX, that is kind of the umbrella method that is used. The $get and the $post are subsets of the AJAX method itself. The biggest difference between the implementation standpoint between those two is that you pass an object into jQuery's AJAX method in order to get all the necessary parameters that you need to make that call. But for the .get and the .post method, you actually pass in arguments and not an object. And that is the big difference between those three. The next question, number 5, what is the difference between .get and .post? The .get method has data that's encoded in the URL by the browser, and it's visible in the URL, and it's stored also in the web history. The .post uses name value pairs submitted in the body that is being sent, and it's part of the HTTP request. and it cannot be seen in the browser bar, so it has a little bit more anonymity to it. So that's the main difference between .get and .post. And then the last question is, how can we change the class of an element using jQuery? So jQuery actually provides 3 different methods that we can use to change the class of an element. We have the add class method, we have the remove class method, and we have the toggle class method. Add class, as its name applies, is it will actually add a class to an element. Remove class will remove the class from the element. And toggle class, what it does is a combination of add and remove class working together. You give it the name of a class. If the element doesn't have the class, it will add it to the element. If the element does have the class, then it removes it from the element. And that is the 3 different ways that you can add a class to an element in jQuery. Hopefully these episodes have been beneficial to you. If they are, feel free to leave a comment below. Feel free to like this video, share it with your friends. My name again is Jennifer Bland. My website is jenniferbland.com. Thank you very much for watching.